Another impromptu Bible study, continuing on in Proverbs 29, um, verse 7. The righteous considereth the cause of the poor, but the wicked regardeth not to know it. Righteous people. This could be Christians in general, but just people that believe and do right things consider the poor. Now, the Bible has been very clear, God has been very clear that through the centuries we are always going to have the poor with us. And that's just how He has orchestrated things. And He expects His people to take care of them in some form or fashion. Which brings us to the whole thought again of money. We're not going to hit on that real hard, but God expects His people to live in abundance. And we bought into the lie, several lies about what it means to be wealthy, what the wickedness of wealth and money and all that stuff that goes with it. But we've just bought into a lie, most of us, and we need to start changing our mindset about money. Because if you really study the Bible and see that all the things that God has asked us to do to take care of the poor, it takes money. It takes money. But righteous people care about the poor and the needy in our world. But the wicked regardeth not to know it. Now, to each his own, because I believe, I know, for the most part, that most people that are out begging on the corners as we drive by are just lazy. You can't cast full judgment, but you can have some discernment. For whatever reason got them there. For the most part, they're currently just lazy and addicted to drugs and alcohol. And there have been many through the years that I've offered to put to work that would not work, and got mad at me for even asking. Okay? So, for many years, I wouldn't even give to them money. But I've come off that a bit for a couple of reasons. One, I know most people do that because of their own guilty conscience. They're not doing right themselves, or they're not going to church. They're not living for God, or they hate God, or whatever, and that's some form of them to do something good, and that is good and right. But a lot of them just do it out of a guilty conscience. And in the human realm, we don't really know, and most of the time we're just aiding them to continue in their debauchery. But see, God, I've realized, doesn't tell me to discern between those that are really poor and those that are lazy and those that are lying. There's been documented stories of men leaving the streets in California that I know about and being followed after they left the street, going around the corner, getting picked up by a limo or one of their super expensive cars and taken to their mansion. All right? But I don't know that. God simply tells me to give. So I've leaned more toward, in my life the last few years, is I just give. Now, if I'm about to give and I got a check in my spirit, then maybe not. But for the most part, I just give. God knows my heart. God will know your heart. Just give, because it's clear that He wants us to give. He wants us to be a giving people. He wants us to help the poor. And it's not so clear that He tells us that, hey, you need to practice wisdom when you give. He just tells us to give. All right? So, to each his own. God knows your heart. Scornful men bring a city into a snare, but wise men turn away wrath. See, scornful men, you have them in churches, you have them in your jobs, you have them everywhere. And it's really sad and disgusting how often this type of stuff goes on in churches. but scorners, bad mouthing, gossipers. It's disgusting. And most people lie to themselves, especially in churches, that we're just, concerned. We're just bringing this up for something for you to pray about. And then I've seen this a lot with preachers through the year. I've experienced it personally. I might end on this because this needs to be addressed. Let me finish the verse. Scornful men bring a city into a snare. So when you're surrounded with scornful people, it brings the people around, the church around, the organization, anybody around that type of thing. It creates snares, problems, stumbling blocks for people. But wise men turn away wrath. So wise men see that, and they have enough wisdom and discernment to turn that stuff away, to either leave it and turn away from it for themselves, or to set things and to say things in such a way that get people to open their eyes and to stop listening to it and to stop doing it. So let me get on this thing for a while. This whole idea of gossiping, and what a lot of preachers, I'm going to focus on preachers right now, and pastors, men in ministry. I've experienced this personally. And I don't know why. God let me see so many things as a young man about preachers and ministry that wasn't right, that caused me to make decisions as a young man for my own personal life and for my family that was good. Because then later on, I adopted some of that stupidity, and it cost me my family. So I don't understand it. In some ways, how I failed my family. But on this one particular thing, there's a handful of things that I've seen preachers do and say as common practice that I've never done. And how they do it and continue to do it and think it's okay. I've experienced this personally. So this gossip, this scorning attitude, they get up behind their pulpits and preach good things, and probably good men, good preachers in general, good pastors. But they got this little dictator attitude, and especially when they get with a bunch of other preachers, they've got this gossiping, scornful attitude. So, a couple examples. There was a man that came to one of these preachers' meetings that he was not a typical Baptist preacher. He had some humility about him, and he had some power on him that most Baptist preachers do not have, which is why he was invited to this meeting. And he got up and preached with power and boldness. And he wasn't like most preachers do at preachers' meetings, just preaching in such a way to get the applause of the preachers. He got up and preached against things that preachers were doing. And he had a certain mannerism. And right now it escapes me exactly what I witnessed as far as what was said, but I saw two preachers after that making fun of that preacher. In a private conversation, I just happened to be nearby, making fun of that preacher. Now, if I see it today, I'm going to call you out on it, boy. Ain't no room for that type of trash. And I will cut you off And I will not put up with that crap. I ain't nobody, but I'm not putting up with that trash. Back then I was just a young man, just in all the preachers, going to preachers' meetings. I saw that as a young man. And another thing I witnessed personally. Years had passed. Years had passed. Years had passed. I mean, I'm talking 30 years. And I ended up serving with the preacher in a church. Oh, it blows my mind. So yes, as a teenager preacher boy, I was a typical teenager. Hard-headed. I was not a bad kid, but I was still full of pride and arrogance. You know, even into my early, well, we'll just say, well, I don't want to beat myself up too much, but definitely into my early 30s before I started mellowing out some, and still carried some of that into my 40s, which cost me my marriage. Don't make it right, but that's what happened. Anyway. People leave marriages for all kinds of reasons, and they justify it all kinds of reasons. And Christians justify it for all kinds of reasons, and the church endorses it for all kinds of reasons, and they just let it go on, they don't deal with it. It doesn't make them leaving the marriage right, no matter how messed up the spouse was, whether it was the man or the woman. God is for marriage. God is for the sanctity of marriage. God is for the marriage to stay together. There may need to be some separation. There may need to be some counseling, but the attitude needs to be, we're going to work this thing out no matter what. Okay, that did not happen in my situation. I had to change. I definitely see room for separation. Definitely see room for, being gone for a while I work on the marriage. But to stay gone and to get divorced, it's not right. But years later, I became part of a church. I'm just going to go long on this. I'm just going to go long because there's a lot of stuff that needs to be dealt with here. And by this time, by God's grace, I am not the man I used to be. Unrecognizable. I'm a different man. I have changed. By that time, that was like 5 or 6 years ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And I've grown up so much since then. See, you've got to acknowledge your sin, your failures, and change. And so, I know I'm not the same man. It's just absolutely unrecognizable. And so I was on my second or third stage of really becoming a better man at that point in time. And I got involved in the church, and I knew, and I had to be involved in that church because that's where my wife and kids were going, and I was making myself available for them. Oh man, there's so much wickedness that happened around this event. And when Christians and preachers and so-called Christian friends allow this type of behavior and they don't check it. They harbor, they abate, aid, spouses leaving, children leaving, without any kind of reconciliation, without any kind of recourse. They just let them do it. They let them live with them. They let them stay with them, and especially with women on the men. It's disgusting. People will say they're Christians, they say they're your friends, but they won't talk to you. They'll give money to. They'll help the spouse leave without talking to the other spouse. Most of the time, it's the man, and they just aid them in their rebellion, and it creates nothing but devastation. It's disgusting, it's wicked, and just because I have personally experienced it doesn't mean I'm not going to preach and teach against it. It's wicked. I'm in this church. And I'm in big debate mode now about what to say. Not that I'm scared to address issues, but that there are some things that if they're seen out of context, it could hurt people. So I'm going to just speak on this, and it'll be a journal. And then I'll probably have to edit. But anyway, I got involved in this church. And I could tell immediately that there's something wrong in this church. There's nothing wrong with having spiritual discernment and some power. And most guys who have some kind of spiritual discernment and power, Charles Spurgeon addressed this issue, are always going to be, I can't quote it right now, but are always going to be attacked by cowards. If you're walking with God really, and you're really reading His Word, and you're really studying His Word, you get that peace and that boldness that passes all understanding. You won't understand it, what you're willing to say and talk about, and it don't matter what anybody else says. It just has to be said. And so I knew in this church, and this particular man, the pastor of this church, I do not mind mentioning his name. I'm not going to mention it here, but in the right circumstances, I will call him out publicly. Because he's a stinking liar. He's a hireling. He's a dirtbag. And I will call his name out. Now, I've forgiven him. He hurt that church. He's still there. He hurt me. I've got over it. He hurt my family. And I want him to repent. I want him to make it right. I'm all for restoration. But he ain't done anything to make it right. And I have found out so much more about that man. And we live in a day and age where the pulpits are filled with these types of men, and we need men who call them out. So I knew in that church there was something wrong with him. Couldn't pinpoint it at the time, but I did know. I could tell this guy ain't got something right. He's got no power when he preaches. He wasn't even apt to teach. The Bible, when he calls him, the Bible tells us when God calls a man, one of the things he gives him is the ability to teach. This man didn't even have that. It was pathetic. This man, half the time, wouldn't even take his Bible to the pulpit, and if he did, he brought another book, and he was reading from a book. The church was small, maybe 20 people. One man was a millionaire. A couple other people well off, paying him a salary of $75,000. Which, hey, I got no problem. I got no problem paying a preacher $500,000 a year. If he's a good preacher and he's powerful and he's grown a church and it's substantial and there's plenty of givers in that church, give that man a good salary, give that man a good car, give that man a good house, give that man a good living for him and his family. Got no problem with that. But when you're a dirtbag and you're a hireling And to my knowledge, I know what most independent Baptist preachers make. He was grossly overpaid and grossly under-delivering. So I knew something wasn't right with him. And I could tell by the lady at the piano. Short hair and a tight dress. Very revealing, playing the piano. Ain't something right here. Ain't something right. Listen, it don't, don't take much discernment to figure that out. But I'm surprised. Most people, it don't faze them. And I sensed something wrong with the song man. There's something wrong. There's something going on here that ain't right. But I was there for my wife and kids. And it doesn't take long. If there's a man in your church that's got any kind of ability, any kind of power, any kind of talent, people want to use them. And so I was preaching, I was singing, I was leading the singing when the song man was out. My family was singing. I preach with God's power. I've got His blessing on my life. It's not bragging, it's just a reality. God tells you, if He calls you, He's going to give you the ability and the power and the talent. So much is coming out of this. It didn't take long to realize that man, that song man, was about, before I ever showed up, was real close. I don't know how close it became, but was about to have an affair with that piano player. And he's married, his wife's in the church. Something happened before I got there. And he was still leading the singing, and she was still playing the piano. From what I gathered, it was less than 2 months before I got there. So evidently it was forgiven. His wife forgave him, whatever, but that man should not have been leading singing. You do stuff like that, you step down. You just step down. So many people in ministry and men in the pulpit, they stay in the ministry after committing gross sins. Let alone there's so many other things that disqualify you, that you need to at least step down for a while till things get fixed. But he's still leading singing, and he was bad. He was not that. He had some musical ability, but he was not a good song leader. That woman didn't last long. She ended up leaving. But I want to go back to the scorning thing. Because at some point in time, I had to call him out on something, the song man, and I had to call the preacher out on something. In private, it was not addressed properly. Those two men got together and began attacking me. And the years ago story I want to tell you about, that song leader, at some point in time, a few months into me being there, we realized that there was a man in my past when I was a young man, at the very oldest, early 20s. Might have been with this man when I was 19, 20, maybe 20, 21. I was with this man, serving under him. And he knew me even younger. He knew me as a 17-year-old teenager. That years. I mean, we're talking now 27, 37, 47. I mean, I was probably 45 when this event took place. In a conversation, we realized that he knew this man. And he volunteered to me. He says, yeah, when I first met this man, he said he knew. No, he was still in contact with this man. And so, whatever conversation they had, he made mention of me being part of that church. And over 30 years, had no contact with that man, that other man. Told this man, because this man told me, he said, when I told him you were at our church, he said, well, be careful of him. And I can't remember what he said. He said it was a hothead. I don't know what he said. But 30 years later, no contact with that man, he felt that he needed to tell this man, well, watch out for him. And that type of crap goes on all over our churches. And I'm an independent Baptist. I've grown up independent Baptist, and I'm willing to shed the name independent Baptist. I don't give a flip about my name or who I associate with. But I know so much crap that goes on in our churches that I've seen personally, heard personally, have experienced personally. And how many people they just scorn, they gossip, preachers scorn and gossip and go on with no power in their life, thinking they're what God wants them to be, and they ain't jack diddly flipping stinking Scott. Scott, that ain't the right word. I messed that word up. But anyway, we'll see. I don't know how far I'm going to go with this one. I'm probably going to redo a video. I don't know what I'm going to do with this one, but whether you see it or not, keep your eyes on him.